19 cops arrested, a state senator in handcuffs, 5 tons of fentanyl seized, and tonight we know who was protecting the cartel all along.
6:14 a.m. inside the Minneapolis FBI field office. Assistant Director Raymond Castillo stood before 43 journalists, his jaw tight, his voice carrying the weight of what federal agents had uncovered across Minnesota over the previous 72 hours. The numbers he released were staggering: 4.7 tons of fentanyl seized, 2.1 million fentanyl pills recovered from a single warehouse in Brooklyn Park, 843 pounds of methamphetamine, 219 pounds of cocaine, 14 human trafficking transit houses dismantled, 37 migrants recovered from a refrigerated shipping container, where 3 had already died from hypothermia, and most disturbing of all, 19 law enforcement officers arrested, including 1 deputy police chief, 2 county sheriffs, and a sitting state senator named in sealed federal indictments. But those numbers only told part of the story, because what federal investigators found inside encrypted servers seized during the raids revealed something far more sinister than drug trafficking. They found a blueprint, a systematic plan to transform the state of Minnesota into permanent cartel infrastructure. And at the center of that blueprint sat one name that would shock the nation. If you want to understand how deep this corruption truly went, stay with me, because what happened next will change how you think about American law enforcement forever. The operation began 3 nights earlier, February 25th, 3:47 a.m., Minneapolis, Minnesota, temperature negative 14 degrees Fahrenheit, wind chill pushing negative 32. The kind of cold that burns exposed skin in minutes, the kind of cold that makes metal crack and engines refuse to start. But beneath that brutal winter silence, something massive was moving through the frozen streets. FBI tactical teams staged at 7 different locations across the Twin Cities. DEA strike units positioned at the Canadian border crossing points. ICE Homeland Security investigation cells embedded in immigrant neighborhoods for weeks, gathering intelligence, mapping safe houses, identifying cartel lieutenants who had been operating with impunity for years. And overhead, invisible to anyone looking up, 2 MQ-9 Reaper drones circled at 23,000 feet, their thermal imaging cameras tracking heat signatures through warehouse roofs and basement windows. The target was the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, mocked the most violent, most ambitious, most technologically sophisticated drug trafficking organization on the planet. And federal intelligence indicated they had built their American headquarters right here, in Minneapolis, in the heart of the Midwest, hidden in plain sight among the warehouses and industrial parks and frozen lakes of Minnesota. The first breach happened at 3:52 a.m., a warehouse in the North Loop District. FBI SWAT operators moved like shadows through crystallized fog, breath visible, boots crunching on ice, thermal scopes showing 11 heat signatures inside. The hydraulic ram hit the reinforced door with 72,000 pounds of pressure. The frame exploded inward. Flashbang grenades detonated in rapid succession, light and sound designed to overwhelm human senses, not to freeze suspects in place for the 3 critical seconds operators needed to gain control. What they found inside defied expectations. This was not a simple drug stash house. This was a distribution command center. 14 commercial-grade pill presses capable of producing 100,000 fentanyl tablets per hour. Laboratory equipment for cutting and processing raw narcotics. A server room with 17 encrypted terminals. And stacked against the far wall, shrink-wrapped bricks of fentanyl powder, totaling 893 pounds. Enough to kill every human being in Minnesota 4 times over. 11 suspects attempted to flee through a hidden tunnel entrance. They did not get far. Simultaneously, DEA units hit a luxury home in Edina, on a 7,000-square-foot lakefront property owned on paper by a shell corporation registered in Wyoming. The residents were not what anyone expected. Not cartel soldiers, not drug dealers. 3 men in business suits, laptops open, financial software running, and a wall safe containing $427,000 in cash alongside 3 burner phones with direct lines to Guadalajara. These were not street-level criminals. These were accountants. Cartel financial infrastructure embedded in a wealthy Minnesota suburb. But the operation was just beginning. By 4:30 a.m., federal agents had executed simultaneous raids at 19 locations across the Twin Cities metro area. Underground gambling operations in St. Paul that served as money laundering. Massage parlors in Bloomington where human trafficking victims had been held for months. A trucking company in Burnsville whose manifests showed legitimate cargo, but whose refrigerated trailers had been modified with hidden compartments capable of moving 2,000 pounds of narcotics per trip. And a restaurant chain with 14 locations across Minnesota, each one serving as a distribution node for fentanyl pills moving to college campuses and suburban high school. The seizure totals climbed by the minute. narcotics, cash, weapons, vehicle, property. The cartel had invested tens of millions of dollars in Minnesota infrastructure, and federal agents were dismantling it piece by piece. The real breakthrough came at 5:17 a.m. inside a nondescript office building in downtown Minneapolis. Agents breached the 6th floor, expecting to find another financial operation. What they discovered instead stopped them cold: a communications hub, encrypted satellite links, real-time tracking software showing the positions of every federal law enforcement vehicle in the state, and a database. Thousands of entries, names, addresses, badge numbers, bank account information, a master list of compromised law enforcement officers across Minnesota. The cartel had not just infiltrated the state, they had cataloged their infiltration with corporate precision. If you understand why this discovery changed everything, hit like so more people see this story. Within hours, the seized servers were transported under armed guard to the FBI's cyber forensics facility in Chicago. Then analysts began cracking encryption layers that had been designed to resist exactly this kind of examination. What they found would take weeks to fully process, but the preliminary findings were devastating. The operation had a name: Project Northern Crown. And it was not simply drug trafficking, it was territorial acquisition. CJNG leadership had identified Minnesota as strategically critical. The state sat at the intersection of major interstate highways connecting the Canadian border to Chicago, Denver, and the entire Midwest. Its immigrant communities provided cover for cartel personnel. Its harsh winters discouraged intensive law enforcement operations, and its political culture of trust and cooperation made it vulnerable to infiltration in ways that border states never would be. The cartel's plan was systematic. First, NIME established drug distribution networks through legitimate business front. Second, compromise local law enforcement through bribery, blackmail, and infiltration. Third, cultivate political relationships that would provide protection at the state level. Fourth, expand human trafficking operations to generate additional revenue stream. And fifth, transform Minnesota into a permanent American headquarters from which CJNG could project power across the entire northern United States and into Canada. The encrypted files showed this plan was not theoretical, it was operational, and it had been running for nearly 4 years. But the most disturbing discovery came from a folder marked Patronado, Spanish for patron. Inside were communications between cartel leadership in Jalisco and a single American contact identified only by a codename: Lobo Blanco, White Wolf. The communications were explicit. Lobo Blanco had received $17 million in payments over 42 months. In exchange, Lobo Blanco had provided advance warning of federal investigations, had influenced state policy to reduce penalties for drug offenses, had blocked legislation that would have increased funding for narcotics enforcement, and had personally intervened to prevent the prosecution of at least 4 cartel-connected individuals. Lobo Blanco was not a street-level informant. Lobo Blanco was someone with genuine political power. Federal investigators began tracing the digital signatures, the encrypted authorization keys, the banking connections, and what they found pointed to one name that would detonate across national headlines within days: State Senator Marcus Donnelly, chairman of the Minnesota Senate Judiciary Committee, a 17-year veteran of state politics, a former prosecutor who had built his career on being tough on crime, and, according to federal evidence, the primary political asset of the Jalisco New Generation cartel in the state of Minnesota. This is not corruption. This is not negligence. This is command-level collusion, and the operation to dismantle it had only begun. Comment expose if you want to see how federal agents brought down an entire criminal network. February 26, 4:45 a.m. The Federal Command Center had relocated to a secure facility in Rosemount. A digital map covered an entire wall, red markers pulsing across Minnesota like infected wounds. Each marker represented a confirmed cartel node, 47 in total, spread across 12 counties, from the Iron Range in the north to Rochester in the south, from the Wisconsin border to the Dakotas. The scale of cartel penetration was unprecedented for a northern state, and the evidence suggested it had been deliberately designed to avoid detection. Small operations, low profiles, patient expansion, the opposite of the violent territorial wars that characterized cartel activity along the southern border. Assistant Director Castillo stood before the assembled task force: 1,200 federal agents from FBI, DEA, ICE, ATF, and U.S. Marshal. National Guard units providing perimeter security and transportation. And for the first time in Minnesota history, U.S. Army Special Operations personnel in advisory role. The mission briefing was direct: 38 simultaneous raids across the state, when every identified cartel location hit within a 60-minute window. No advance warning, no media leaks, total operational security. The political situation had become critical. Governor Patricia Hartwell had activated 3,500 National Guard troops following a series of deadly shootings in Minneapolis over the previous 2 weeks. 7 people killed in what police initially described as gang violence. But federal intelligence revealed the truth. The shootings were targeted eliminations. Cartel security operations removing potential witnesses and unreliable associates before federal pressure intensified. The violence had served another purpose. It provided cover for the massive federal mobilization. The public believed National Guard troops were responding to gang shooting. They did not know those troops were actually providing support for the largest cartel takedown in American history. At 5 a.m., yes, the operation launched. DEA strike teams hit a methamphetamine superlab hidden inside an abandoned grain elevator near Mankato. The facility was producing 300 pounds of crystal meth per week, supplying markets from Minneapolis to Milwaukee. 14 suspects detained. Laboratory equipment destroyed in controlled demolition. 112 pounds of finished product seized before it reached the streets. FBI tactical units breached a fortified compound outside Duluth, a lakeside property that surveillance had identified as a cartel command post. Inside, agents discovered sophisticated communications weapons, including 2 fully automatic rifles and a crate of fragmentation grenade. And most critically, a complete organizational chart of CJNG operations across the northern United States. Names, positions, contact protocols, territory assignment. The cartel had documented their own expansion with the precision of a Fortune 500 company. ICE Homeland Security investigations teams simultaneously hit 7 human trafficking locations. Victims recovered included 23 women and 14 minors, some held for months in conditions federal agents described as horrific. Medical personnel were required at multiple scenes. The human cost of cartel operations was visible in the faces of those freed from captivity. And at 5:47 a.m., U.S. Marshals executed an arrest warrant at the home of State Senator Marcus Donnelly. The senator did not resist. He emerged in a bathrobe, his wife weeping behind him. His attorneys already on the phone demanding to know the charges. The charges were extensive: conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and a federal statute rarely invoked against American politicians, providing material support to a transnational criminal organization. By 7 a.m., the scope of the operation became clear. 473 arrests across Minnesota, nearly 5 tons of narcotics seized, $27 million in cash recovered, 14 properties and businesses subject to federal forfeiture, and a political scandal that would consume the state for months to come. But federal investigators were not finished, because the seized servers continued to reveal new layers of corruption. And the deeper they looked, the more they understood that Senator Donnelly was not acting alone. If you're still watching, share this story now so the truth reaches more people. The forensic examination of cartel databases revealed a corruption network that reached far beyond one state senator. Law enforcement infiltration had been systematic and devastating. 19 officers across 7 departments had received payments, some as modest as $2,000 per month for information about patrol schedules and upcoming operations. Others receiving 6 figures annually for active interference with investigations. Deputy Chief Raymond Torres of the Minneapolis Police Department had received $412,000 over 3 years. In exchange, he had ensured that certain drug arrests never resulted in prosecutions. That evidence mysteriously disappeared from property room, that informants in certain neighborhoods were identified and eliminated. 2 county sheriffs in rural Minnesota had provided something equally valuable: territory. Their departments simply did not patrol certain roads at certain times. Cartel convoys moved through their jurisdictions without concern. Way stations were closed for maintenance when shipments passed. Traffic stops were avoided on routes identified as cartel transportation corridors. And 5 state troopers had provided real-time intelligence on federal operations. Every DEA investigation, every FBI surveillance operation, every planned raid. The cartel knew about them hours or sometimes days in advance. Targets fled. Evidence disappeared. Operations failed. Federal agents had wondered for years why their Minnesota investigations produced such poor results. Now, they knew. They had been compromised from within. The internal betrayal devastated honest officers. Lieutenant Sarah Chen of the Minneapolis Police Narcotics Unit had lost 3 confidential informants over 2 years. All 3 murdered within days of providing information to her team. She had blamed herself, questioned her tradecraft, wondered if she had made mistakes that got people killed. Now she knew the truth. The mistakes were not hers. Her unit had been penetrated. Her operations leaked to cartel security. Her informants identified and eliminated by people wearing badges just like hers. The federal investigation documented 117 instances where law enforcement corruption directly enabled cartel operations. Drug shipments that should have been intercepted, human trafficking victims who should have been rescued, witnesses who should have been protected, all sacrificed on the altar of cartel payoff. This was not a police department with some bad actor. This was a parallel enforcement structure, a second police force serving cartel interests while wearing American uniform. And the evidence suggested it had been deliberately constructed over years of patient cultivation. The badges would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. Type justice if you believe these officers deserve maximum sentences. The scope of Project Northern Crown extended far beyond Minnesota's borders. Federal analysts mapped the transportation network and discovered a Continental system designed for maximum efficiency and minimum detection. CJNG had established Minnesota as a hub. Narcotics arrived from Mexico through Texas and Arizona crossing points. They traveled north on interstate highways through Kansas and Nebraska. They consolidated in Minneapolis warehouses, and from there, they distributed east to Chicago, Detroit, and eventually New York, north to Winnipeg and Toronto, west to Denver and Seattle. The Minnesota hub processed an estimated 400 pounds of fentanyl per week, enough to generate $15 million in street revenue, enough to kill 200 million people at standard overdose thresholds. The transportation system exploited legitimate commerce. Cartel-owned trucking companies hauled actual cargo, food products, agricultural supplies, manufacturing components. Hidden within those legitimate shipments, concealed compartments carried narcotics. The trucks were legal. The cargo documentation was accurate. Only the hidden compartments distinguished them from thousands of other vehicles on American highways. Border crossings from Canada provided additional opportunities. CJNG had cultivated relationships with indigenous communities on both sides of the border. Some of these relationships involved coercion. Some involved shared economic interest. All of them provided crossing points that avoided traditional customs inspection. Federal investigators estimated the Minnesota network generated $200 million annually for CJNG, a significant portion of their total North American revenue. And the network was designed for expansion. Plans recovered from seized servers showed Phase 2 development targeting Wisconsin, Iowa, and the Dakotas. Phase 3, expansion into Montana and Oregon, and Phase 4, integration with Canadian distribution networks. The cartel was not just operating in America. They were building permanent infrastructure for a drug empire that would span the continent. One file stood out among thousands, a strategic assessment dated 18 months earlier, written by a cartel intelligence officer in Guadalajara. The document evaluated Minnesota's potential and concluded with a phrase that haunted federal analysts. This territory is ready for harvest. The seeds we have planted now bear fruit. Within 5 years, Minnesota will belong to us as completely as Jalisco. This was not criminal activity. This was conquest. And the federal response was only beginning. The aftermath of Operation Northern Crown continued for weeks. Court appearances and bond hearing, evidence processing. The federal justice system strained under the weight of 473 defendants. State Senator Marcus Donnelly was denied bail. The judge cited flight risk and evidence of ongoing communication with foreign criminal organizations. His 17-year political career ended in a federal detention center, awaiting trial on charges that could result in life imprisonment. Deputy Chief Torres attempted suicide in custody. He survived. He would face his charges from a hospital bed. The two compromised county sheriffs resigned immediately. Their departments were placed under federal supervision. The 5 state troopers were terminated and arrested within hours of identification. But the cost extended beyond the perpetrators. The Minneapolis Police Department faced a crisis of legitimacy. How could communities trust officers when the department's own leadership had been working for drug cartels? How could prosecutors build cases when evidence chains had been compromised for years? Chief Vanessa Morrison, appointed just 18 months earlier, announced a complete internal review. Every narcotics case from the past 5 years would be examined. Every officer would submit to financial disclosure. The department would rebuild from the foundation. It would take years. The damage that took years to create would take years to repair. But something else emerged from the devastation: determination. The honest officers who had been betrayed by their colleague, the prosecutors who had watched cases fall apart without understanding why, the federal agents who had suspected corruption but could never prove it. Nearly all of them now had something they had lacked before: the truth. And the truth was a weapon. Share this story if you believe that corruption must be exposed regardless of who it protects. The final briefing occurred on March 15th, 3 weeks after the initial raids. Assistant Director Castillo presented the complete assessment to the Attorney General in Washington. The statistics were comprehensive: 473 arrests, 94 confirmed cartel members, 19 compromised law enforcement officers, 1 state senator, $412 million in assets seized or frozen, nearly 5 tons of narcotics removed from distribution, an estimated 47,000 saved by preventing that fentanyl from reaching American streets. But the numbers could not capture the human dimension. On the trafficking victims now in recovery program, the families who lost loved ones to overdoses traced to this specific network. The communities living in fear because they knew cartel operatives lived among them. The children who watched their parents arrested, not understanding that those parents had been protecting the people who were poisoning their neighbors. Minnesota would carry the scars of Project Northern Crown for a generation. Yet there was also hope. Federal and state cooperation had proven effective. The National Guard activation, initially triggered by the cover story of gang violence, had provided essential support. The honest officers who remained had demonstrated that the badge still meant something to those who wore it with integrity. And the cartel had learned a lesson as well. American territory was not undefended. Northern states were not easy targets. The infrastructure they spent 4 years building had been dismantled in 72 hours. CJNG leadership in Guadalajara would think carefully before attempting this kind of expansion again. Their investment had been destroyed, their personnel captured, their methods exposed. That was not victory. Victory would require dismantling the entire organization, but it was progress. It was proof that resistance worked, that the systems designed to protect American communities still functioned when the people within them honored their oaths. The siege of Minneapolis revealed something profound about power and corruption in America. Cartels do not need violence to conquer territory. They need only patience and silence, and the ambition of people willing to sell their offices for profit. Senator Donnelly did not personally move narcotics. He did not pull triggers. He did not traffic human beings. He simply looked the other way, blocked the legislation that would have empowered investigators, warned his contacts when pressure increased, made himself useful in quiet ways that added up to catastrophic consequences. This is how democracies fall, not through invasion, through infiltration, through the slow corruption of institutions designed to protect the public interest. Minneapolis was a warning, a glimpse of what happens when criminal organizations treat American territory as investment opportunities, when they cultivate political assets the way corporations cultivate lobbyists, when they build infrastructure with the patience of entrepreneurs and the ruthlessness of occupying armies. The fentanyl that would have reached American streets from the Minnesota network would have killed children, teenagers, parents. The human trafficking victims freed from those houses would have suffered for years more without intervention. The corruption that shielded these operations would have spread deeper, compromised more institutions, made future enforcement even more difficult. Operation Northern Crown prevented that future, but only for now, only in this place. The cartels will try again. Different state, different method, different political targets. The question is whether America will be ready. If you made it this far, you understand what's at stake. Like this story, share it. Comment never again so others know where you stand, because this story is not over. The trial of Senator Marcus Donnelly begins in September. The internal investigation of Minnesota law enforcement, the recovery of trafficking victims will take years. And somewhere, right now, in some other Americans, cartel operatives are evaluating opportunities, identifying vulnerable politicians, cultivating law enforcement contacts, building the infrastructure for the next Project Northern Crown. This was a fictional dramatization inspired by real issues facing American community. The names of officials and specific operational details were invented for storytelling purposes. But the threat is real. The methods are documented. The consequences are measured in lives lost and communities destroyed. Minneapolis proved that resistance works, that federal and state cooperation can dismantle criminal networks, that honest officers still outnumber corrupt ones, that the American justice system, for all its flaws, still functions when people demand accountability. The question now is whether that resistance will continue, whether the lessons of Minnesota will spread to other states, whether the political will to confront cartel infiltration will survive the next news cycle. That depends on you. On whether you share this story, on whether you demand answers from your representative, on whether you remember that democracy requires vigilance, and vigilance requires information. The siege of Minneapolis is over. The war for American sovereignty continues, and you have to choose which side you're on.